Are you ready for Drew Pavlou to finally be called out for his actions? Just so that you guys know who Drew Pavlou is, who it is that we're dealing with here. I will show you a picture of our subject today. This person right here. Get a look at him. Remember that face. That's who we're talking about. Drew Pavlou, an Australian, quote, political activist, unquote, who really doesn't like China and he wants you to know about it. This is Drew Pavlou. There was recently a profile of Drew Pavlou, activist or attention hog. Drew has an obsession. His dad wishes he'd drop it. Imagine inviting journalists into your house to talk to your family, and this is the profile they give you. What Drew Pavlou did is basically, he's been since he was a teenager, I believe, or perhaps early 20s at the very latest. He's been doing nothing but protesting in Australia against the Chinese government. And since then, he's branched out into other sorts of things right now, he's running cover for Israel. He's very much sort of your generic sort of liberal who likes to couch their pro-Israel advocacy as sort of a both sides thing. You know how it is. But we're exposing him today. This article isn't so much exposing him as it is just very funny. Some of the quotes here. My dad tells me to get rid of this obsession. He'd like me to get a real job. That's a direct quote from Drew Pavlou. Why would you say that? Willingly. It's so weird too. He says in this article, Pavlou began questioning why left-wing activists on campus were so passionate about the Israel-Palestine conflict, indigenous disadvantage, and refugee rights, but in his view, had little to say about China's egregious human rights violations. The hypocrisy stuck with me, he said. This is interesting because your government and every single one of the governments of the richest countries in the world are vehemently anti-China. They talk about and invent shit about China constantly all the time. So maybe the reason why people feel the need to protest against those other things, but not the shit about China, is because those other things are not being backed, being put forth, being rallied behind by literally the most powerful states in the world. That might be it. You don't have to pressure the Australian government or the United States government or the Canadian government to be anti-China. They're already anti-China. You do have to pressure them to be anti-Israel. You do have to pressure them to be pro-indigenous, obviously. If you choose, if your way of becoming a supposed dissident, a supposed activist, is to choose the target that is already the target of your government, of every other Western government, which are obviously the most powerful and most richest governments in the world, and also the dominant ideology in your country and in all those other countries as well, you're not exactly much of an activist, are you? You're just an advocate for the powerful. You're an advocate for the status quo. Still, this is just, a very funny article. He'd like me to get a real job, Pavlou said about his dad. Yeah, I bet he does. Anyway, there's more to this story. Because Drew Pavlou is not just some random kid who just talks about politics. Drew Pavlou ran an election campaign in 2020 for the Queensland Senate. He was unsuccessful. But during that election campaign, what happens is when you run an election campaign, you have to disclose who funds you. And there was a very interesting donation that Pavlou received. This is from Public Records in Australia. So Pavlou's 2022 election campaign received a donation from Silver River Investment Holdings Pty Ltd. This is owned by one Simon Fenwick, who is listed here, obviously, in this disclosure form as the director. Who is Simon Fenwick? Let's take a look. There's a profile of him in this article in the ABC. And this is talking about him as a major no donor. What that means is that Simon Fenwick was the biggest donor, at least up until the point this article was written, to the No campaign in a recent Australian referendum. The No campaign was a vote against the Indigenous voice to Parliament. He funded this campaign to advocate for the No vote in a referendum to give Indigenous people a powerless advocate to Parliament. He donated $750,000 to that campaign, which was run by the conservative lobby group Advance Australia, according to this article. Apart from that, Simon Fenwick was described by Josh Roos, an associate professor of political sociology at Deakin University. It's pretty clear that he considers himself to be an ideological warrior of the right, who warns about an organized socialist threat, and he criticized prosperity-destroying climate gestures. So a climate change denialist as well. Roos continued saying he rails very powerfully against what he considers to be the cultural Marxism that's underpinning Australian politics. He talks about brainwashing, identity politics, and he rails against climate change. That is, he rails against action against climate change, not against actual climate change. Mr. Fenwick has contributed almost $400,000 to the Liberal Party, which if you don't know, are right-wingers in Australia, like the generic two-party, in the two-party system, they're the right-wing party. $75,000 to the Liberal Democrats, which is like a minor libertarian party, right libertarian party. And $25,000 to the anti-Chinese Communist Party activist Drew Pavlou. That's referring to this, as you can see here, in their disclosure form. You see that they donated in two lots of $12,500, a total of $25,000 to Drew Pavlou's election campaign. So Drew Pavlou was funded by a right-wing culture warrior who also funds the Liberal Party, which is this Australian, generic conservative party similar to the Republicans, right-wing libertarians, and icing on the cake. The last federal election, he also donated $24,500 to Michelle Wild, a conspiracy theorist One Nation candidate. One Nation in Australia is essentially like the anti-immigrant, borderline or actually fascist party, led by Pauline Hanson, who is an absolutely notorious figure in Australian politics. She's like basically the Australian, what's her face? Like the French one? Marine Le Pen, that's the one. Yeah, she's like the Australian Marine Le Pen. So you can see this all right here in this article in the ABC, all reported publicly. Why did Drew Pavlou, who I'm pretty sure describes himself as a progressive, let's see, let's search his tweets. Does he call himself a progressive? It seems that all he does is complain about progressives, really. No, here he says, I'm a progressive. I'm a progressive, he says. Opposed to anti-Semitism and tankies. So he's a progressive. And he took money from Simon Fenwick. He took money from a guy who also donated to the Liberal Party, to the Liberal Democrats, and who previously donated to One Fucking Nation. Like, that this guy even wants to donate to you is already a problem. It already should cause you to be like, what the fuck? But to actually accept those donations, there's something going on there. There's something weird there. So, someone who describes himself as a progressive accepted donations from a right-wing or far right-wing figure who is a major donor to anti-progressive causes in Australia. Also interesting that this ABC article describes Drew Pavlou as an anti-Chinese Communist Party activist. Imagine being an anti-Chinese Communist Party activist as an Australian with no connection to China. That's just fucking bizarre, dude. But that's by far the worst thing. Drew Pavlou accepted a large sum of money from a big-time far-right donor who himself has expressed obvious far-right views. Someone who's also donated to One Nation. Extremely fucking weird and concerning. And the only reason why we know about this is because this is required to be public by Australian law. You have to disclose your donors. Your donors have to disclose who they donated. The donors have to disclose who they donated to. Very inconvenient for Drew Pavlou there. There's a lot more to this man, Drew Pavlou. Recently, he has praised Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who recently died in prison. Pavlou, on his Twitter account, referred to Navalny as a martyr for freedom. Very interesting that Pavlou praised Navalny like this, given what Navalny had to say about Muslims and Palestinians as well. This man who he praised as a martyr of freedom, compared people from the ex-Soviet South Caucasus region to cockroaches. It was not just people from the South Caucasus. By the way, this was a video for a group that he had founded. He presented himself as a certified nationalist who wants to exterminate flies and cockroaches while bearded Muslim men appear in cutaways. He whips out a gun and shoots an actor wearing a keffiyeh who tried to attack him. Now, a keffiyeh is very clearly a Palestinian item, so this is someone who simulated executing a Palestinian and who called Muslims flies and cockroaches. And Drew Pavlou said that he was a martyr for freedom. But don't worry, there's more. There's much more to Drew Pavlou. Drew Pavlou has a long history of using the anti-Semitic slur capo against Jewish people who aren't pro-State of Israel. Jewish people who support the Palestinian cause in ways that he thinks shouldn't be allowed by him are called capos. Not only did he say it, he said it, and then he doubled down on it. For him, Max Blumenthal, who is Jewish, is a capo. Absolutely disgusting. Drew Pavlou, additionally, was arrested under suspicion of calling in a bomb threat against the Chinese embassy in London. This was reported on in articles such as the curious case of the Australian activist arrested for threatening to blow up China's embassy in London. This is especially concerning, given that Drew has since then posted on Twitter about his intent to blow up a statue of Chairman Mao. Someone who has previously been arrested on suspicion of making bomb threats wants to blow up a statue. I bought this Mao head for $1,200 and paid $300 first installment. My goal is to find a creative way to blow this thing up in a desert or rent a tank for a day and drive over it. I mean, even aside from the fact, this is just weird. Like, if someone bought like a massive Netanyahu head and said that they would blow it up in the middle of a desert, I'd think they were a bit psychopathic, because that doesn't do anything. You're just like doing it because like to own the, the people online or whatever, something that you think would make them angry. The thing that's concerning about this though is that someone who was previously arrested under suspicion of making bomb threats would just so openly and brazenly talk about how they want to blow something up. This is very concerning. He's even said, he's gone down, he's continued to say this later on. He says that he still needs to blow up the statue of Chairman Mao. And he's investigating the legalities surrounding the use of explosives in the state of Queensland. He explicitly outlines his intention to detonate explosives. Is this legal? This is extremely, extremely concerning. Don't worry, folks. Well, do worry, because there's a lot more weird stuff about Drew Pavlou here. There is a court case, public information, a court case from 2016 involving family members related to Drew Pavlou. In this case, the judge ruled that this was a case about allegations of a Ponzi scheme, and the judge ruled that the scheme did have the hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme in light of the transactions that he had discussed. Pavlou's family members were involved in this Ponzi scheme. Now, it's not clear from the court document, like, it's not clear whether they were in on it or not, but what is clear is that they benefited from it. And the court documents directly say that they did. As you can see here, the benefit for Andrew Pavlou was $269,395. The benefit for Nicholas Pavlou was $235,464.84, right down to the cents. And apparently there is a Pavlou superannuation fund, and superannuation in Australia is like a retirement fund. So with respect to the Pavlou superannuation fund, the net gain was $269,395.80. Now, perhaps the Pavlou family benefited from this without their knowing. Maybe they didn't intend to. It's impossible to glean this from the court documents themselves, but it is very, very weird that most of the people involved seem to have lost money. Very few people did gain money, and the ones who gained money happen to include Drew Pavlou's family. Related to this as well is the fact that Drew Pavlou's family were owners of a property that appears to be 6 units subdivided into a total of 30, which, for a supposed progressive activist who likes to talk on Twitter about the housing crisis, if you search Drew's tweets, there's plenty about it. Look at all these tweets about the housing crisis. But it seems very weird that he comes from a family who were landlords of such a sort of property subdivided in that way that is clearly detrimental to the housing market, since it removes 6 potential housing units to rent them out. And Drew himself admitted to this on his Twitter. He says when he was 12 years old, which is about 12 years ago, which isn't exactly that long ago, his family owned a block of flats which rented cheap rooms to exchange students and backpackers from Europe. According to Bad Empanada, that means I'm a slumlord. So I had found this property, which is it's aptly named 12 Vulture Street. Couldn't fucking name it any better. And Drew admitted that his family had owned it. Currently, 12 Vulture Street is being advertised with 30 rental rooms, which will make its owner $272,000 per year. It has 6 bathrooms. So from the fact that it has 6 bathrooms, I think it's reasonable to guess that this place is probably 6 overall units. Or at the very least, it's clearly like a plot that could be used for normal, 6 normal houses that is being used instead to, basically to make money for the owners rather than to actually give people housing. 30 rooms with 6 bathrooms shared between them. Not a good look for a progressive activist who always posts on Twitter about the housing crisis. Not a good look at all. Honestly, he could have just denied this. I don't know why he admitted to it. They could only afford to buy it in the first place because my grandmother tragically and unexpectedly died of stomach cancer at a very young age and left my mum a small inheritance. A small inheritance? It's worth $3.3 million. It's sold. No, it's not worth. It's sold for $3.3 million in 2022. A small inheritance? How small was that inheritance? Only 10 years ago you owned this property. Doesn't seem very small to me, Drew. Now, one thing that Drew Pavlou likes to do a lot of is protest against the Chinese government. At least he says that it's against the Chinese government. But some of his protest methods have seemed pretty suspect. Like, he was ejected from the Australian Open because he went there with t-shirts saying, where is Peng Shuai, who is like a Chinese tennis player who I believe made Me Too allegations against someone in like the Chinese tennis establishment, and since then hasn't been playing. So he's like obsessed with the Chinese government or something. He went to the Australian Open and just like made noise about that the entire time while just targeting China. And there was one point where like he actually approached a Chinese tennis player and asked her where Peng Shuai was, as if she's supposed to know. There's an article about it in Yahoo. Activists criticized for questioning Chinese players at Australian Open about Peng Shuai's whereabouts. Like, imagine going up to a random Japanese person on the street to try to hold them for account for what the Japanese government is doing. That's so fucking weird. Why would you do this? Why are they, just because they're Chinese tennis players, they're supposed to know? Just because they're Chinese? This is part of a pattern of behavior that Drew Pavlou has. For example, in another instance, he intentionally went to an area with lots of Chinese people in literally an Asian market, knowing that Chinese people would be there, intentionally going to a place where he knew there would be Chinese people to hold up a sign saying, "Fuck Xi Jinping." Drew Pavlou loves to post on Twitter about how insane and anti-Semitic pro-Palestine activists are or anti-Israel activists are. Can you imagine what his reaction would be if someone went to like a Jewish or an Israeli fest market or something and held up a sign saying like "fuck Netanyahu" or "fuck the Israeli government" or "fuck Israel" or whatever? He would be up in arms about how anti-Semitic that is. Yet he went to an Asian market intentionally with a sign saying "fuck Xi Jinping," obviously trying to seek out Chinese people who he knows, at least some of them, would be angry at that. Very, very worrying behavior here. And again, there's more of this sort of behavior because Drew Pavlou, when he was still a student at the University of Queensland, he publicly posted on his social media accounts this. As a student rep, this is his own Facebook. As a student representative, it's my job to keep students safe. That's why I placed the UQ Confucius Institute. The Confucius Institute is a Chinese language institute under total and complete lockdown until biohazard risk is contained. He posted this on the 15th of March, 2020, during COVID, during the pandemic. He shows up in a biohazard institute outside a Chinese language institute. We all know what this is meant to imply. This is a very worrying pattern of anti-China behavior, of anti-Chinese behavior, given the fact that he actually targets Chinese people and seems to hold them accountable for the actions of the Chinese government, or what he believes to be the bad actions of the Chinese government. This is even worse. Now, this is a fresh Twitter account. It's brand new, hasn't used Twitter at all. What happens when we go to Drew Pavlou's Twitter? You scroll down a bit, and then what Twitter does is it recommends you accounts that are similar to the account that you're looking at. We see this part, who to follow. Who to follow who's apparently similar to Drew Pavlou. This account called Say No to Sino. Now, if you've ever heard the term Sinophobia, which means hatred of Chinese people, this is an account that just brazenly says, say no to Sino. Essentially, say no to Chinese. Say no to Chinese people. No one would name their account this if they were just against the Chinese government. It's very worrying that someone has such a pattern of behavior that this is the sort of account that gets recommended by Twitter as being similar to them. But personally, if I was considered to be similar to this account, I would take a good long hard look at myself and wonder what I'm doing, wonder if my actions are appealing to the wrong sort of people. You see, this person here actually follows Drew. Personally, if I have a follower who is like this, who is very clearly a racist given their username, I would block them immediately. The second that I see them following me or that I'm informed in any way, shape or form of their existence, I would block them. I hope that Drew Pavlou will at least block this account. Say no to Sino. That's just disgusting. Frontline Australia, this guy says. This guy thinks he's on a frontline battle against China. So that's 3 separate instances where Drew Pavlou has clearly targeted Chinese institutions, Chinese people, for protests supposedly against the Chinese government. If you want to protest the Chinese government, at least direct your protests against the Chinese government, rather than going to an Asian market, rather than going to a Chinese language institute in a biohazard suit, rather than approaching random Chinese tennis players and asking them to recount for what you believe their government has done. Very bad form. Interestingly, Drew Pavlou was suspended from the University of Queensland for this behavior. Similar behavior, at least. He was targeting of China, supposedly of the Chinese government. According to him, his suspension was reduced, but he was suspended until 2021. Essentially, this guy is the definition of a serial pest, of a just generic attention seeker who seeks attention in the worst possible ways. He's either not very conscious of what he's doing, or he is very conscious of what he's doing. If it's the first one, then he should definitely cease what he's doing. If it's the second one, then there's not really any convincing him, because obviously he knows exactly what he's doing. And Drew Pavlou has been absolutely obsessed with posting attacks ever since Israel started attacking Gaza. Israel to date has killed about 30,000 people in Gaza by official figures, I believe. And he basically just posts on Twitter incessantly, multiple times per week, attacking people for being against what Israel is doing in Gaza. I don't know, it's very weird that someone, well, it's not particularly weird because obviously being anti-China and pro-Israel, at least he wouldn't say he's pro-Israel, but given the fact that he pretty much exclusively, when he's addressing the topic, it's pretty much exclusively to scold pro-Palestinian people, it is pretty clear that he is pro-Israel and just trying to hide it through like this, oh, I'm for peace or whatever. Give me a break. It's not super surprising that someone who started out as being basically an obsessive anti-China serial pest would end up being a pro-Israel shill. What is worrying though is that there is an account, for one, the big donation that he got from Simon Fenwick, who is a far-right donor, a far-right culture warrior, in ways that go far beyond just being anti-China. So clearly he believed that donating to Drew Pavlou was in line with his interests, into causes that are very obviously aligned with people like Simon Fenwick, like being pro-Israel, like trying to attack people who are against the genocide in Gaza ostensibly from a progressive lens. It's very suspect. Luckily for him, he's not legally obliged to disclose his funding sources. He's not legally obliged to disclose if he's being paid by anyone, aside from during his election campaign, where unfortunately for him, he was legally obliged to disclose that sort of thing. It's very weird that he pivoted to be so just wishy-washy pro-Israel while claiming to be a peace activist or whatever. His concern is not with the 30,000 dead Palestinians, it's with like policing people who are denouncing the 30,000 dead Palestinians in the wrong way. Barely a post here and there for the actual victims of this. Nothing but attacks on their advocates. There's also a very interesting post by an account called Alternate Media Watch, which did a bit of investigation into Drew Pavlou's tweets and found that he just so happens to post like the same post from the Australian Jewish Association, which is like a far-right pro-settler Zionist organization. Drew was asked directly by journalist Michael West on Twitter if he has entered into any arrangement, verbally or in writing, which may convey any financial benefit to him or his associates, either now or in the future, with any person or organization. I don't know where the second part of this thread is, but the next question is obviously, which pays you for pro-Israel advocacy. And the reason why people suspect this of him is that Drew Pavlou posts the same tweets, not exactly the same tweets, but the same subjects as the Australian Jewish Association does. Like this tweet. The Australian Jewish Association posted this image denouncing it. Drew Pavlou posted this image announcing it. The Australian Jewish Association made defamatory allegations against two men of having vandalized or breaking into a Jewish cemetery and Holocaust memorial, and Drew Pavlou made that same allegation against these two men. Later, it turned out that these two men were innocent, and both Drew Pavlou and the Australian Jewish Association deleted their posts. There's more. Australian Jewish Association posted this. Drew Pavlou posted the same thing. Australian Jewish Association posted this. Drew Pavlou posted the same exact screenshot of the Instagram account. And Drew Pavlou obviously is extremely dishonest here. He calls this spray painting a furniture store owned by a Jewish Australian to own the Australian government. Well, who owns Eureka Furniture? Nathan Brisblatt. So this post here provides some context. The business is owned by Nathan Brisblatt, who has bragged about providing support for the Israeli military. And according to this guy here, this is just spray painting a furniture store owned by a Jewish Australian. Nothing else. There's no extra context here. But even aside from that, it's very interesting how many times Drew Pavlou has posted, like on the exact same topics as the Australian Jewish Association, which, as I said, is a far-right radical pro-settler org, especially given the fact that he has previously accepted $25,000 for his election campaign from someone who is very clearly a far-right figure, given that that guy obviously donates to the Liberal Party, to the Liberal Democrats, to One Nation. So yeah, Drew Pavlou, ladies and gentlemen, he's finally been exposed. He's been desperately hoping, I'm sure, that no one puts all this information on him together. But now it's happened. All factual information based on clear evidence. I deal solely in the truth. And everything that I've stated here is based on very clear evidence. Drew Pavlou was factually arrested on suspicion of having made a bomb threat to the Chinese embassy. Drew Pavlou has factually accepted $25,000 from someone who donates to one nation. We can only guess based off that whatever undisclosed ties Drew Pavlou may have with far-right linked organizations. I think it would be good if Drew Pavlou, given his advocacy for causes that the far right clearly believes are aligned with our interests, given that someone like Simon Fenwick donated such a large sum of money to him, clarify his connections to such groups, to make public financial records that could show us that he is purely posting his anti-China, anti-Gaza rhetoric, attacking anyone who is against what Israel is doing in Gaza in what he believes to be the wrong way, which just so happens to be almost anyone. It would be great if he could clarify whether or not he's doing it because he's profiting off it, or whether he's just doing it because he genuinely believes in such abhorrent ideas. Drew Pavlou has been exposed. Very weird too, that images of Drew Pavlou appearing to be detained in Australia exist. No such images exist of me, even though people have accused me before of being arrested. Yet, weirdly, there is no image of me being pushed up and searched or frisked at the back of a cop car, as there is for Drew Pavlou. Remember, this is the face of Drew Pavlou, someone who accepted $25,000 from One Nation donor Simon Fenwick. What more is there to say about this person? What more is there to say about a guy who wears a biohazard suit outside a Chinese language institute, and he's finally been exposed? He's finally being held to account for his actions. It's been a long time coming.